AI attacks are coming. In the next 3 to 5 years, they're going to become very dominant, and the quantity and quality of them is going to go way up. So what that translates to is the only networks that are really going to survive are networks that use formal methods, because even small bugs can be catastrophic to the system.
Hello and welcome to the BeInCrypto podcast. Now, the Cardano ecosystem became the center of intense discussion across the crypto industry after reports surfaced claiming the blockchain had either gone down, halted, or even experienced a major hard fork. But this does not reflect what actually happened. So today we're joined by Charles Hoskinson, founder of Cardano, to walk us through what really happened, clear up some of the misconceptions that have been doing the rounds. Charles, it's really good to have you on the BeInCrypto podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. And okay, so I suppose not to go into all the technical details, but can you walk us through in simple terms what actually happened during the network partition and why actually crypto Twitter responded the way it did?
Yeah, we can get into that. I mean, it's complicated stuff, and we'll try to make it simple. So it was soft fork with a long chain reorg. And basically what happened was that there was a bug in a cryptographic library, a very obscure one in 2022. And when we upgraded software in a recent version of our node, it activated that bug. So there was two independent things that had to happen that were separated by about 3 years. And so what that meant was that if people were on the old version of the node, there's a certain type of weird transaction that if you did, it would just ignore it. But if they were on this newer version of the node, the bug would actually accept the transaction. So you'd have an irreconcilable history between the two nodes. So what happened is somebody on the testnet realized this and tested it. They broke the testnet. It turned into a soft fork. So there's kind of two networks running at the same time, independently making blocks of each other. And we said, oh, that's really nasty. We got to get a patch. So we built a patch. We started deploying the patch, and then the following day, an attacker attacked the network by delegating that transaction that he's discovered from the testnet onto the mainnet. And then this split Cardano into two pieces, and basically both pieces were still making blocks. They were still processing transactions, but they were kind of living different histories. So this happens in Bitcoin a lot, but it's always the short term. They're called orphan blocks. So if two miners make a block around the same time, you'll have two versions of Bitcoin. And then the next one to make a block, the other block gets thrown away. It's called an orphan block, and they reconcile back together. So there's been about 3,000 orphan blocks in the history of Bitcoin over the last 15 plus years. So Nakamoto proof of work and Nakamoto proof of stake, it has this unique property where it can have a situation where there's two chains, they come back together. That's why historically people in Bitcoin land have always waited multiple confirmations before they accept the transaction and say a transaction's final, because technically you can have a chain reorg. This was unusual because it wasn't just a block or two, it was several hundred blocks, and it took about 14 hours for the network to self-recover. But it didn't require a hard fork, it didn't require a checkpoint, we didn't have to stop the network. In fact, the network was running, and that's one of the reasons why there was a double spend potential, because you trade one set of problems for another set of problems. When the network halts, no one can do anything, so the whole network shut down. When the network's still running, you have two versions of history. If an attacker recognizes that, they can take advantage of exchanges, bridges, and DeFi applications to gain a financial advantage there if those guys aren't aware fast enough. And so what ended up happening is everything kind of worked the way we thought it was going to work. The early detection systems came in. We had a pretty good idea that we were in a soft fork situation. The exchanges, bridges, and DeFi, they kind of shut down during that period of time. Nodes had to make a decision. Do we bet on chain A or chain B? We call it the pig chain or the chicken chain. Which chain do you want to go with? And so they either roll back to the old node or you leave the node that they have. So we got the network upgraded, and within 14 hours, the two networks became one. So then what happens to the orphan history? The orphan history gets thrown away. There's about a 94% similarity between the two. So there's about 6% of the transactions on the orphan chain are going to be dropped. So we're doing some forensics right now to see if anybody took advantage of that window of time to financially harm exchanges or bridges or DeFi. And Intersect is working with our science team, and they're doing a whole forensics because we have copies of both chains. We archive them, and we can compare the histories of the two and put them back together. It's important to point out,
Right.
normally proof of stake can't recover from this type of attack. Usually when you have a split, because they run BFT protocols, they're final the minute you make a block. So you have two irreconcilable histories, and there's no longest chain notion like Bitcoin has. So usually your solution is you shut the network down, you manually put the network back together, you issue a checkpoint, and then you forever change the history of the chain. Because we designed this like Bitcoin was designed, we designed it from a situation where occasionally you'd have a situation where you'd have two chains and they come back together. You lose some orphan blocks in the process. People lose some block rewards and some transactions get dropped, but the chain continues operating uninterrupted. So if you download a fresh node, you start from the Genesis block and you go all the way to the tip of the network, you'll have one uninterrupted history, no hard forks or no checkpoints required.
Okay. Okay, but didn't stop the Twitter space with different headlines and different posts claiming that Cardano suffered a hard fork. From your perspective, why did that narrative take off so quickly?
Well, Ouroboros is totally unique. So normally if this would have happened on Ethereum or Solana or another network, because they use a BFT style, it's going to result in a hard fork and an irreconcilable history, and you can't put it back together. You have to manually put the chain back together. So if people don't understand how Ouroboros works, when they see a network partition like this, they just operate on the assumption that the network has failed and it's going to take weeks to put back together. They don't realize that actually we have the same failure model that Bitcoin has. We designed the protocol very deliberately. So that's one dimension of it. Another dimension is this, Twitter is Twitter. They whenever there's an incident, they like massively enhancing the drama and these types of things. Like for the attacker, for example, they say, this vibe coder brought down the whole network. Well, the attacker that's been identified has been in the network for 6+ years, was a deeply sophisticated person, was actively watching the testnet. The attack was already discovered on the testnet. And what the attacker did is took that transaction and translated it to figure out how to replay the transaction on the mainnet. So it wasn't like AI just came out of nowhere and said, go attack Cardano, and it magically figured out an attack. The attack was already known. It was more of a question of how do you translate it from a testnet attack to a mainnet attack. They're nearly identical, so it's quite easy to do that. So that's something that AI can do. So this actually reinforces the security model of Cardano, because, we've been uptime 8 years, and not only could we recover from this, the reality is AI attacks are coming. In the next 3 to 5 years, they're going to become very dominant, and the quantity and quality of them is going to go way up. So what that translates to is the only networks that are really going to survive are networks that use formal methods, because even small bugs can be catastrophic to these systems.
So do you see this as like, I suppose the silver lining here could be it's a stress test for the future more sophisticated AI attacks that are going to hit every blockchain?
Yeah, because the thing is, the cost and knowledge required to conduct an attack is going down. So it used to be attacker, you have to be like a really elite information security expert. And a lot of those guys are white hats. They understand the consequences of going black hat, and they don't want to go to prison. But when you're a script kiddie, you don't think like this, but you don't have the technical skills to launch an attack on complex software. But if AI can understand the complex software, AI plus a script kiddie, 3 to 5 years, every script kiddie is going to be a black hat. The only people who survive are the people that have invested heavily in formal methods, because that's where you can use mathematical proofs to verify the programs are correct.
Now, Charles, this incident came from a known bug being exploited in a new way, possibly through AI-generated code. So how does the Cardano team think now about staying one step ahead of these evolving AI sophisticated attacks? Charles, if you could just explain, like, what next, then what's happening in Cardano to combat this?
Yeah, so you have 3 layers that you do. One is that you look at all your quality assurance and quality control, and you say, are we investing enough in testing? Are we using the right type of testing? And how can we do better to proactively prevent and discover bugs? Then the next layer is diversity. So you want independent implementations of the software, because that helps discover a ton of bugs, but also adds a little bit more resilience, because those independent implementations will likely not suffer the same types of bugs as one implementation. And then the third layer of the system is to have a canary network that allows you, when these types of things happen, if they happen, to have earlier detection. The faster you detect something like this, the faster you can respond to it and avoid economic losses from occurring. So you need a canary net. So we're going to design a canary net for 2026 to go beyond an informal ad hoc thing where we're just kind of watching and talking to each other. And we'll actually have an extra layer for the system that gives an extra layer of security. And part of a canary net, I did a nice video on this. It's about 45 minutes long, where you also talk about insurance. So blockchains can actually create their own assets and self-insure when disasters happen. So you can create a real world asset where people can stake ADA or something, and in the event that a hack occurs or the network goes down, whatever those losses are, it's insurance policy against it, but then the premiums get paid out as a real world asset to people using DeFi. So you can self-insure a blockchain with its own treasury to cover incidents that come up, because no matter how good you are with early detection, coding, and other things, there will be bugs. We got major one in 8 years. Okay, so that tells you the rate. So in 8 years from now, we'll come back on the show. We'll talk about the next big bug that nearly killed Cardano. And we'll say, look how we recovered and how smart we are. But, the next time it happens, the economic losses will likely be more because the ecosystem will be larger. So at some point, you need insurance to cover these things, either internal or external. And I like the idea of a blockchain self-insuring. And then it creates some nice social processes in addition to an economic process, in addition to coding processes to resolve it. Because, it's just like saying, can you build a building that's fireproof? Well, you can make a building very fire resistant, but at some point you have to buy fire insurance.
Yeah, Charles, so let's talk about, blockchains going into the future. Now, which of these two risk factors are you most sort of concerned about? Would it be AI proofing blockchains or quantum proofing blockchains?
Quantum is a big red herring. I've spoken extensively on it. We as an industry know how to make things quantum resistant. The reason we're not actively doing it is the protocols to do that are about 10 times slower and 10 times more expensive to run. So nobody wants to be the blockchain. There's like a competitive issue here that says, you know what? I have 1,000 transactions a second. Now I'm going to do 100 transactions a second, but I'm quantum proof, so nobody wants to be that guy. So that was one dimension of it. The other dimension is we had to wait for the US government to write the standards. The reason being is that even though we have protocols, until NIST wrote FIPS 203, 204, 205, and 206, we did not know what the official position was of what is legit crypto and what's not. It's relevant because the hardware manufacturers like AMD and ARM and Intel and NVIDIA, they write specialized circuits to match those standards. So if you pick a non-standard protocol, then what ends up happening is you're 100 times slower than the hardware accelerated stuff, because they have specialized cores to do that crypto inside their systems. So now that the standards are out, the US government's starting to migrate, we basically say, okay, it's probably time that we pick a date. So then there's a question of what is that date? So DARPA has a program called QBI, the Quantum Blockchain Initiative, and they're measuring 11 different companies right now to see if they can build a quantum computer at scale by 2033. So if as a journalist, you're interested in tracking that objectively, I think the DARPA QBI program is the best benchmark ever developed for whether you have a legit and real quantum computer, because the military needs to know. They're like, when do we upgrade our crypto and how do we do that? Most smart people think there's a strong possibility we'll have something in the 2030s. Some smart people think it'll be the 2040s or 2050s. Some smart people think it'll be earlier. If I had to bet, I'd say in the 20s, there's a very strong likelihood, greater than 50% chance, that we'll have a quantum computer that can run Shor's algorithm, which effectively would defeat classical crypto. So we have a 3-year plan for how we're going to upgrade Cardano and Midnight and other things to a post-quantum world, and it's part of the roadmap. And it's some of its optimization and some of its standardization, and some of it's just gradually rolling it out inside the system. And there's layers of defenses that you put in, but then at some point it's fully there. Two big primitives you can bet on: hashes and lattices. Real quickly, hashes are what Ethereum is doing. We're going to bet on lattices because we think they have some superior properties. But it's kind of like Blu-ray versus HD DVD. The market's going to fight it out for a little bit, and then they're going to pick a winner, and then you just fucking deal with it. So if hashes win, hashes win. If lattices win, lattices win. That's the other challenge, is there's very distinct paradigms of where you can bet, and there's trade-offs for each side. So we've picked some trade-offs, and Ethereum's picked some trade-offs, and the market will eventually decide which standard wins.
Well, that's interesting. Potentially Q-Day 2033. Who knows, if we're looking at that particular computer that you talked about. Just finally, it's been great chatting to you today. Now, looking forward, what improvements, upgrades, or community-led initiatives you're most excited about at Cardano at the moment, and especially forecasting going into 2026?
Yeah. Well, it's all coming together for Cardano. We did the heavy lifting. We built a protocol that can stand one of the worst possible incidents of fork, and a soft fork reorg, whereas our competitors would have had a hard fork, a hard stall, and a manual reset. So I think this proves to anybody building, it's like, okay, if I build on Cardano, it has the same resilience that Bitcoin has, but it has all the proof of stake benefits, meaning you have that massive scalability. So now we just got to turn on the scalability for the system. And there's DApp level scalability. That's what Hydra is about. And we already have some turning that on, like Delta DeFi and others. And that can go up to 1 million transactions a second, as we demonstrated with Hydra Doom. So that's very future-proofed. And then the layer 1 scalability is Ouroboros Leios. And we have actually a website we just launched to showcase the real-time development. We have a follow the sun model. So we're literally implementing that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So when one team goes to bed, the next team wakes up. And we should see somewhere between a 60x to 100x throughput improvement at the base ledgers. Scalability is a big ticket item now that governance is done and decentralization is done. The other is development experience and really improving the development experience. So we have technology called Starstream that the community is building, which has composability and a path to better data availability and these things. And the final thing is we major investments in integrations and DeFi development. So get all the big actors for bridges, oracles, and stablecoins to integrate into Cardano because we're ready for it now. And then also build up the top 10, top 15 DeFi applications of Cardano and kind of walk up the MAUs, TVL, and transaction volume. We have a very unorthodox model, so we had to master that model before we could actually go all in. But 2026 a year, we go all in. Plus, we have Bitcoin DeFi, and we have Midnight. Midnight's launching here in just like 6 days. And then Bitcoin DeFi is going to be gradually turning on throughout next year. So a lot of Bitcoin will work its way into Cardano because we have the same accounting model. Their UTXO work, UTXO. So if you're a Bitcoin developer, developing on Cardano into Bitcoin is actually the easiest way to build Bitcoin applications. You're using the same accounting model, a very similar paradigm. In fact, we're even getting Aiken, one of our languages, on Cardano to work on Bitcoin script. So you can write an Aiken smart contract and deploy it on Bitcoin. So you can use our dev tools for that stuff, which is very unique to Cardano. It's very different on Ethereum or Solana. They have a different model than Bitcoin does. So it's just a year of growth. There was a lot of infrastructure years where we were just getting all the plumbing in, pouring the concrete, getting the basement, and, getting the governance right, getting the decentralization right. And you have to experience attacks like this to prove out the infrastructure. It didn't stop. They were making blocks. Block rewards are paid. 94% of the transactions submitted that day got into the chain. So the fact that the chain, under the worst case scenario, where it's literally 2 networks, can come back together and self-heal without centralized intervention, it's a good testimony to strong protocol design. There's a lot of cleanup that we have to do to make it even stronger for the next time, but it's a testimony that Ouroboros was basically built to stand like Bitcoin. Bitcoin's survived this on its small reorgs 3,000 times throughout its history, and Bitcoin is the most reliable cryptocurrency because of that design.
Well, here, look, it's just been excellent chatting to you again, Charles. I chatted to you actually a couple of years ago, and it's great to catch up again. Now, we heard about Cardano, the network, self-healed, without the need for centralized reboot or intervention. And Charles, we'd love to get you back on in 2026 just to talk about some of those developments that you talked about there. All very exciting.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks, Charles.